Could you tell me a little bit about how immigrants and immigrant workers are more vulnerable during the curfew and lockdown?
Mhm. Well, today, which is the 26th of January, the Immigrant Workers Centre issued a press release and an appeal to the media, basically to draw attention to the issues of the ways that the curfew is impacting non-status workers. Um, so if you think about the reality on the ground, there's a lot of different elements of the economy that have been declared as essential. So that includes places like the Dollarama Distribution Center, which is actually the main distribution center for all Dollarama shops in North America. So there are many hundreds of workers there, and it's a 24-hour operation. So that means that there's a night shift, and the reality is for the Dollarama distribution center, the corporation uses something that's called employment agencies, which are basically ways for companies to outsource the labor responsibilities they have under law. This means that a lot of non-status people are hired in more precarious conditions. So if you think about the curfew and the existing precarity that non-status workers face, the curfew heightens that danger. Um, for example, in the case of the Dollarama distribution center, the workers are getting sort of notices on their phone, which they can then apparently show authorities if they're asked any questions, but that they don't have their names on it on these notices. And if police ask for more identification, that can create a very dangerous scenario. Same goes for delivery drivers, right? If we think about Uber Eats, if we think about various restaurants, often people in precarious status are doing those jobs too, or sharing those jobs with other friends. People are struggling to survive in various ways, and we have to also underline the fact that non-status people don't have access to the same government support, right? It should be obvious, but I think that sometimes it's easy to forget that within the mainstream media discourse. So the final point being that the extra policing powers that have been given within the context of the curfew here in Montreal do create more precarity. And what we're trying to say is that, okay, these are essential workers, but they then need their papers. We need to grant status to everyone without status in the city. And within this media release, we wanted to highlight specifically non-status essential workers and the fact that they should have equal rights and be respected, which means that they need status now.
Is there a certain amount of is there a number of cases you're willing to share where you're hearing that non-status people are being approached by police officers and they're kind of having difficulties because they don't have papers with their names on them and identification that shows they're a Canadian citizen?
Yeah, so we have heard from a number of members of the Immigrant Workers Centre, particularly within the delivery and driver sort of realm, working for various companies about how difficult this is. And then also workers, we've had an ongoing campaign, just for a bit of context, to support Dollarama workers within the warehouse. And many of the workers we know are non-status, and some of them work at nighttime. So what we want to highlight is that they're in a dangerous scenario, and they've stepped up and they're working in the pandemic and at nighttime. And the curfew just underlines the existing inequalities in a lot of ways. And so we wanted to highlight that. The reason we issued a media release today is because we felt there have been some important critiques of the curfew, particularly around how it impacts people struggling with precarity in terms of homelessness, which is very important. And the Immigrant Workers Centre stands with organizations like Resilience Montreal and the Native Women's Shelter, who have been doing really important work to highlight that issue. But one issue we didn't see being covered very much, and affects members of the Immigrant Workers Centre, is the ways that the curfew impacts people with precarious status.
Um, so I actually I spoke to Mustafa a couple years ago when you guys were putting together the campaign, considering Dollarama,
Mhm.
and I spoke to a worker from Dollarama, and he was saying really horrific things, like people falling, breaking their legs, and they're not kind of being covered, and they're having to take time off work, being unpaid. Would you say that you're seeing a similar thing, but towards COVID? Like, is there maybe COVID outbreaks, or people at risk of getting COVID at Dollarama or other warehouses in Montreal?
Well, there's been a number of cases that have been reported, not just at the Dollarama warehouse, but also within food processing plants around Montreal, not just in the city, but outside of the city. Um, and so there is a danger, especially within the context of distribution centers for food, but also for goods. Uh, um, a lot of these places, basically, as you mentioned, there are very documented cases of injustice and violence in terms of lack of rights on the ground. But COVID has only exemplified this broader systemic issue. So if we think about, the reality of like a warehouse distribution center, we're talking about hundreds of people in an enclosed space that is basically staffed 24 hours a day. There's not a lot of resources given for cleaning, and that is no fault of the workers, but that's because of neoliberal style budgetary decisions that don't prioritize health and safety, but instead prioritize fast motion towards profit. So yeah, I think COVID has underlined these realities, and the curfew, which we're highlighting today, only underlines a lot of these systemic inequalities.
Absolutely, thank you.
Mhm.
Um, So I've been sort of looking into, where COVID cases are high in Montreal, and I'm seeing that a lot of these neighborhoods, Montreal North, Park X,
Yeah.
Hochelaga, it's a lot of neighborhoods where there's many immigrants and many working class people. Would you say that you find that these communities are kind of more at risk to contracting COVID than other communities are?
Well, thanks, Savannah, for bringing that up. And I think we could really look at that in regards to the urgency of status for all and how that impacts workers, and the fact that that demand has not been fulfilled. Well, if you think about it, given that people can't access public support programs if they don't have papers, um, people are forced into these types of employment situations of cramped conditions, long hours, night shift at times, as we've seen with Dollarama as an example. So then we have scenarios where people are then coming home to their families. And if we think about Montreal North and Park X, you mentioned those neighborhoods, and I think they're great examples, not of a great situation, but of systemic issues of people living in housing where there's maybe a lot higher rate of occupancy within one unit. People are sharing space, through a sense of resourcefulness, but it's because of a low income often, and because of precarious status. Um, so of course, people are bringing COVID um, back to those areas of the city, right? And I think that it just underlines the fact that um, you can't sort of ignore one part of the population and expect COVID to go away, right? So COVID-19 has illustrated interdependence and interconnection, and the way that we are all um, sort of subject to the danger of COVID. Of course, it disproportionately impacts communities that have experienced marginalization and systemic oppression and injustice. However, if that continues, COVID is not going to end because, whether it's about distribution of goods or food, um, in the agricultural sector, also, or in transport, delivery, um, those are human beings. And the reality is that COVID spreads, and so you can't sort of pretend that those people don't exist. And the persistent acceptance of the reality of non-status workers doing essential jobs is that it's going to haunt everybody because those people have less access to a healthy and sustainable framework for life because they don't have papers and can't access the same support. And so that affects, in the end, everybody. Of course, it affects those people on the front lines with precarious status in the deepest way first, but it affects all of society.
Thank you. So I'm just wondering, say for example, I was a newcomer to Canada and I'm working, I guess, a Dollarama factory, and
Sure.
I contracted COVID, and I had reached out to you and the IWC and maybe asked for some sort of help or assistance. In
Mhm.
this kind of situation, what would you be telling these people, or what resources would you be kind of directing them to? I know that's a bit difficult, but
No, no, no problem. I mean, Immigrant Workers Center basically is a path for people to act collectively and to work together to address these situations in public. That's today, the 26th of January, the basis of our media release about the ways the curfew impacts non-status workers. However, also there's very specific things that people can do. There are ways to file complaints with the Quebec government around labor standards and labor codes. So the Immigrant Workers Centre very tangibly supports people to make those claims. It's much harder to do if you're without papers. So in that case, there are a number of ways that also the Immigrant Workers Center has challenged employment agencies for unjust practices. Um, and so in general, what we're trying to do is raise awareness about these issues, but also tangibly support people. And the last thing I'll mention is that that also means supporting people who have precarious status around immigration or refugee claims, trying to direct people to legal support that is meaningful, lawyers that we trust, but also to walk people through um, their journey towards trying to attain status. So that means support for applications in various ways, and also to try to understand the bureaucracy, because one of the issues is that a lot of people don't have the either the time but also the experience of navigating Canadian government bureaucracy or Quebec government bureaucracy. There's language issues, there's the anxiety that comes with that. And so the Immigrant Workers Center volunteers, staff, community members that are part of it have always tried to step up in those ways. It is not enough. It's a drop in the bucket in terms of these issues, unfortunately, because one small community organization, and there's a number of really great community organizations doing similar work in the city, whether it's Project Genesis, also in Côte de Neige, whether it's the network Solidarity Across Borders, whether it's the South Asian Women's Community Center. There's a lot of organizations that are doing good work on this front. But unfortunately, and I think it's important to acknowledge this, it's never enough, because there have been political decisions made at the highest levels of government in Quebec City and in Ottawa to allow this situation to continue. And that essentially creates a framework where people with precarious status can be exploited in the context of work.
absolutely. Thank you so much. So this just popped into my head, and I don't kind of have the background on this, but I remember, I guess, 2017, Montreal established itself as a sanctuary city. Um, I'm not quite sure if that's still kind of in effect and how much this helps in that situation. But if it is still in effect, is it really helping non-status folks, and especially considering this situation that we've been discussing?
Well, I mean, a true sanctuary city would mean that the city would also need to make a plan to tangibly support people's journey towards getting status. And the sanctuary city call or press release or whatever you want to call it didn't actually equal any sort of consequential steps that would be taken to give sanctuary in a true sense, which means that non-status people get status and have the same legal rights as everybody else. So that never happened. So sanctuary city is a great thing to say, but what does that actually mean in terms of policy? And beyond that, there was never any clear, absolute directive towards the Montreal police to not allow them to be able to ask for people's immigration ID. Um, so in the case of the curfew, this has come back to haunt us because non-status essential workers, if they're asked for their ID, they're in trouble. I would just point to the example of New York City, where the administration of Bill de Blasio had run their campaign. One of their ideas that they were floating was to create a New York ID, and that was actually implemented. So now in New York City, if you have an address, and that also I should underline includes shelters, um, you can get a New York City ID. And the NYPD was given directives that basically said that this New York ID card would be considered a proper ID, as it were. Um, and so that really gave an avenue, not a total avenue, not a solution for everything, but at least people would have an ID card that was valid, that didn't depend on status from the federal government. We don't have that here. So if we're talking about sanctuary city, we need to see something like that. And that's one of the demands that we highlighted in the press release today, 26th of January, 2021, which is that we need to see something like that in Montreal, where people have an ID card for the city that is not dependent on status. I mean, a lot of people who are deemed to have no status have a lot of status in terms of the community, their role in the community and in the neighborhoods, in their places of work, in their families, in the adjacent schools. That's a lot of status, but the problem is that status on the community level is not recognized in an administrative sense from the state. That needs to change.
I actually didn't know that about New York City, so that's really great to hear. I hope we can see something like that here. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
What was I going to go on to ask? Yeah, kind of backtracking to curfews and police stopping non-status people. Have you heard of any circumstances where maybe this is kind of turned into police brutality, or these folks have been detained or anything kind of like that?
Well, what I can say is that we have members that have been stopped and asked for their ID from police. These are asylum seekers, people with precarious status. We haven't heard of any examples of overt police violence. However, the entire framework is violent because you have people out there working at night, supporting the community, doing essential jobs, feeling precarious and feeling in danger. So we have been talking about these issues as the Immigrant Workers Centre, as the migrant justice movement in general, many organizations for years, saying that this systemic inequality needs to be addressed. And unfortunately, and I don't really say this with anything in my heart other than to say I'm worried, to say that this scenario could lead to something really not good. So we need to address the issue. And when I say not good is, you know, if police are demanding for somebody's ID and they're fearful around their immigration status, right? It's totally understandable to see and understand why somebody might want to get out of that situation. And when we think about systemic racism in the police and how they treat people um, on a consistent basis, um, in regards to racism and how that plays out in terms of policing, I hope it doesn't get to that point. But the the reality is we never know. And what we're trying to say is that we want to avoid those scenarios. And one clear way of avoiding that is by granting people status. So there isn't that sense of tension and stress, in addition to all the other existing tensions and stresses when asylum seekers or migrant workers interact with the police, anyways, in a normal scenario. I mean, this whole thing isn't normal. It isn't normal that there are thousands and thousands of essential workers in Canada who don't have papers. That needs to change.
I guess I'm just trying to bring a little background information into, you know, what type of jobs non-status people are going into in Montreal. Do you maybe are you maybe able to list some of the more sorry, I'm kind of failing to phrase
No,
this.
no problem.
um,
I
I
understand.
guess, yeah, you know what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, so generally in Montreal, there are a lot of non-status people who are working in um, warehouses. So those are distribution centers for like a lot of the big stores. So stores like Dollarama that depend on a distribution center for the goods to be stocked. Also working in cleaning, um, also in meat processing and packing plants around the city. And then there's a lot of informal work, so contract work around, you know, various contexts. I mean, that includes, as I mentioned, the agricultural sector. So these sort of employment agencies that hire people on part-time basis. That's not directly in the city often, but just outside of the city in places like Alma in Quebec. So there's a variety of sectors. I think it also should be mentioned it includes delivery drivers. So, you know, next time you order pizza, make sure to tip your delivery driver. They might be working in this type of scenario, in this type of situation. So those are all things to consider. Uh, there are non-status people working in the context of the pandemic in many essential services. And I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that and to create a different scenario where non-status people's rights are respected, which means that they get status. And that's going to benefit everybody because it will benefit our society and move us at least one small step towards a more just social contract.
Thank you. So would I guess like a lot of these people are really at the front of the line and you know providing a lot of the essential work and without them we wouldn't you know be able to comfortably be at home and be safe from
Yeah,
COVID.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the point, right? Because um, people with precarious status can't stay at home often because of low income, because of the fact that they can't access government support. So, what it comes down to is that the capacity to remain at home and remain safe does depend on a workforce that, in quite a few cases, is made up of workers who don't have access to full rights. You know, that is that is like a situation where you have different classes of human beings, some with rights, some with no rights. You know, and international law. Um, there's many UN protocols around the rights of migrants, around the rights of asylum seekers, but also around equal access to working rights in terms of labor codes. the International Organization of Labor, which Canada is part of, has many protocols in regards to this. And the presence of non-status workers um, really underlines the ways that the Canadian state and also the Quebec government is failing in regards to all of this. And I do encourage people to look it up because I think it's quite interesting to see the specifics. Yeah.
Thank you. Um, so in December, I was in Park X doing some interviews, and I spoke with Monique Leger. She's from an organization that helps provide food to people who can't afford it, and she was saying to me that in some cases, some non-status folks won't get tested for COVID because they're scared if it comes out positive, they're not able to go to work. It can put them at risk of
Yeah.
being evicted, not affording other necessities. Is this something that you're seeing as well?
Well, of course, because I mean, in terms of like park extension, which you talked about, there's a lot of non-status people who are also in precarious housing, right? So um, I think that when it comes down to is the fact that you have entire neighborhoods within the city of Montreal that are precarious in terms of housing, precarious in terms of status, precarious in terms of working rights. And, let's be honest, it's not a mystery. Like, it's not as if the government doesn't know these things. I mean, they have a huge amount of resources to understand this reality, but it's allowed to happen, right? It's not as if the government is just somehow, oh, well, we had no idea there was thousands of non-status people in Montreal working in essential services. They know this, right? So it's a political decision to not take action on the issue. And that needs to be addressed, whether it's about the reality of people living in Park X or Montreal North, many different neighborhoods in the city.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And I guess, outside of these ID cards and kind of changing the curfew, what else would you like to see done by the government to help non-status folks?
Well, we need status now for people without status. I think a Montreal ID is a good step. It's not a total step, but it's a good step. I think that also there needs to be the imposition of better um, labor rights, right? So, for example, in the case of like warehouse distribution centers, these these middle companies, not really corporations, but like temporary employment agencies, are sort of acting like middlemen, where basically they take a cut and they're uh, taking on the role of hiring people instead of the company, like Dollarama in the case of their distribution center beside Metro de la Savane. And, there was a government report about the practices of these temporary placement agencies, and there were recommendations. They haven't been implemented. They need to be implemented. So there's a number of very clear actions that can be taken in regards to the police. There needs to be a policy implemented where there's a don't ask, don't tell in terms of policing and the ability of the police to ask questions in regards to immigration status. But I just want to underline that don't ask, don't tell in terms of policing isn't enough, because we need to address the underlying precarity. We need to address the fact that people don't have papers. So there's a number of issues. Today, the Immigrant Workers Centre issued a release about that. I would encourage people to check out the Immigrant Workers Centre website, which is iwc-cti.ca. So that stands for Immigrant Workers Centre Centre de Travailleurs Immigrants. So that's iwc-cti.ca. You can find our press release there. And as mentioned, we work with a number of organizations in the city, including the South Asian Women's Community Center, Project Genesis, Solidarity Across Borders, many groups to try to continue to bring attention to these issues.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I know I kept you for a long time.
Okay,
I just
no
had
problem.
one last question. I wanted to ask a little bit. I know you mentioned this already, but in the case of Dollarama, where a lot of people pre-COVID were even at risk to these injuries and they're getting unpaid, why do companies like Dollarama get away so easily with these things when they have non-status folks working for them?
Well, it's because there's a political decision that is made. The government knows that Dollarama and other, for example, agricultural distribution centers employ non-status people. There's relationships between politicians and heads of companies and major institutions. For example, Dollarama, um, there's quite a, on the case of Dollarama, there's quite a large amount of investment from McGill endowments into Dollarama. You can find it on the McGill website, millions of dollars. So that's just an example. Power talks to power, and people without status don't have power. So what we're saying is that community power matters and collective power. And so we need to change the narrative. The pandemic has illustrated interdependence to a degree, but we need to take that awareness about collective interdependence and collective health and collective well-being, and also all the rhetoric around supporting essential workers, and move all those very positive conversations towards policy changes. And um, they won't happen quickly. The only way those changes will happen is through struggle and community organizations and collectives and grassroots action bringing attention to these issues. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to issue our immediate release today.
Thank you so much. And is there anything that I didn't ask that you think is important for me to know and viewers to know?
Well, independent media is really important. CUTV is a really important outlet to try to highlight unfiltered voices from community organizations to highlight these issues. Um, Corporate media, I think, and also state media, including the CBC, has taken some steps to bring forward some of these more systemic questions, especially during the pandemic. But what I want to see more of is the voices of people affected, but also of community campaigners who are working on these issues to talk about not just emergencies, but also about vision and the direction of our society and how we can take consequential steps around policy to change uh, economic, political, labor, environmental policy, and change directions because we need to. It's obvious, it's urgent. But I think one of the important things that community media does, like CUTV, like CKUT radio, is to provide a less cut up platform for such voices. So thank you so much for taking the time today to highlight the Immigrant Workers Centre.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and thank you so much again for
My
that.
pleasure. Okay, take care,
Care.
Savannah.
Be
Bye-bye.
safe. Bye.
Yeah,
Thank
you
you.
too.